In this video, we're gonna tell you all about Betsy Braddock, aka Psylocke, or at least one of the Psylockes. Betsy's beginnings. The superhero who would one day be known as Psylocke among other codenames was born to the wealthy Braddock family in good old England. She had been given the name Elizabeth, and she had an older brother named Jamie and a twin brother named Brian, who would go on to become the superhero Captain Britain. Betsy's mom was also named Lady Elizabeth, while her dad was a man named James Braddock. Here's the thing though, James isn't exactly what you'd call a regular old British aristocrat. In truth, James comes from an alternate dimension called Otherworld, where he was initially tasked by the mystic Merlin to stay on Earth in order to fulfill his destiny of siring the man who would become Captain Britain. Brian. Elizabeth, or Betsy as she was affectionately called, grew up in eloquence as the daughter of well-to-do parents. However, things started to take an unusual turn when Betsy manifested her mutant abilities in her teen years, the power of telepathy. Although this revelation didn't initially turn Betsy's life in over her head, what truly changed her trajectory was the tragic death of her mom and dad. From there, Betsy decided to take to the skies and become a chartered pilot, all the while working on the side as a fashion model. Along the way, she'd find out that her twin Brian had already become the superhero Captain Britain. In fact, the event would cement Betsy's status as a mutant telepath involved Brian, as she had a precognitive vision of her brother being attacked by a villain called Lord Hawk. This then opened up a whole new world for Betsy, as she found herself joining the PsyOps division of British intelligence agency Strike. One of her first missions involved infiltrating the mysterious cabal called the Hellfire Club. In this particular adventure, Betsy would have her first brush with the rest of the Children of the Atom when she met Warren Worthington III, aka Angel. Suffice it to say that Betsy still just had one foot in the superheroic door at this point, as she mostly worked as a psychic government spy than an actual vigilante. You could even say that she took on more of a supporting role behind her twin whenever he had adventures as Captain Britain during this era. However, she'd soon become a full-blown superhero when she took over the role of Captain Britain from Brian. Now, we wouldn't go into too much details as to why Brian initially hung up the Captain Britain mantle. All you should know is that he was duped by a sentient computer named Mastermind into doing so. In any case, Betsy became the new Captain Britain after this. Wearing the costume, he gave her additional perks too, such as super strength and flight. She'd come under the tutelage of another British superhero named Captain UK, and they'd work together for a time. Betsy would lose her eyesight when the villain Slaymaster blinded her during one of her escapades as Captain Britain. This prompted Brian to pick up the costume again after he sensed what happened to his twin sister. Long story short, Brian defeated Slaymaster. In the aftermath, Betsy refused and offered to have her eyes cybernetically repaired, but she didn't exactly go blind. In a way, she was still able to see using her mutant ability, kind of like Daredevil. Betsy would get engaged to her boyfriend at the time, Gabriel, and they'd take some time off the high-octane action of British superheroics. Now, it would be nice if this is where it all ended for Betsy, but little did she know that she was about to become one of Marvel's most iconic mutants sooner than later. The birth of Psylocke. What was supposed to be a peaceful vacation at the Swiss Alps for Betsy turned into a pivotal event in her life when the villainous interdimensional TV executive Mojo kidnapped her. Mojo took Betsy to his home dimension, aptly called Mojo World, where the grotesque blob performed experiments on her. Namely, Mojo grafted Betsy with cybernetic eyes to bring back her vision, and then brainwashed her into becoming one of the TV production stars. And it's here that Mojo gave Betsy the codename Psylocke, the same name that Betsy would be best known by. Eventually, Betsy was freed from Mojo's hold when the New Mutants and the X-Men intervened. They then took her to Xavier's school for gifted youngsters after that, where she was welcomed with open arms due to her mutant heritage. Mojo would return and try to mess with Betsy and the X-Men again, but she and the New Mutants would team up to put a stop to the sleazy interdimensional executive in the end. Betsy would then take well to her new role as part of the Xavier mutant family, where she mostly took on a supporting role for the rest of the X-Team. During one of the X-Men's adventures, Betsy would find herself battling none other than the deadly feral mutant Sabretooth. Afterwards, she'd be offered a slot in the main X-Men roster, and she'd fully embrace the Psylocke alter ego from this point on. As Psylocke, Betsy would go on numerous missions with the X-Men, such as facing off against the likes of Kane Marco, aka the Juggernaut. Now, what you should know is that Betsy Braddock isn't exactly what you'd call a classical lawful good character. Her character aligns more with a chaotic good or lawful neutral role. There's no better example of this when she straight up suggested taking out the superhero Havoc after he found out that she and Storm were planning on forming a sort of Wetworks X-Men team. They didn't go through with it, but this formed a strain between Psylocke and Havoc's relationship. leadership. Psylocke eventually found herself assuming temporary leadership of the X-Men after the team seemingly got dissolved too. Now Psylocke is widely recognized as this telepathic ninja assassin, but she isn't the only one recognized for that same thing. Let me explain. Things get a little weird here, so buckle up. The villainous Matsu Suriyaba, a high-ranking member of the criminal organization called the Hand, kidnapped Betsy. Matsuo then did a whole Freaky Friday experiment on Betsy where he switched her consciousness with that of Kwannon, Matsuo's lover, who was in a coma and who also happened to be a legit ninja assassin. From here we get introduced to the Psylocke most of us are probably familiar with. Psylocke would briefly get brainwashed again, this time by the Mandarin, but Wolverine would rescue her and she would go on to harness Kwannon's body to become the X-Men's trademark telepathic ninja as part of the team. Psylocke, who is now a bona fide unit who wielded psychic blades in her hands, was soon drafted into the X-Men's blue team led by Cyclops, and boy did she prove herself to be valuable. For one, she was able to go toe-to-toe against the likes of Magneto during her stint with the X-Men's blue team. For another, Betsy even got to stretch her skills in espionage when she went deep in cover to infiltrate Matsuo's Hand faction and ultimately defeat the crime lord. On a more personal level, Psylocke started to have a thing for Cyclops and pretty much tried to use her ways to seduce the visor-wearing Boy Scout, but Cyclops resisted. What's worse though is that Cyclops' lover Jean Grey found out about this and tried to interrogate Betsy about it. The interrogation was cut short, however, when Kwannon attacked Psylocke. Kwannon took her out and started to claim that she was the real Betsy Braddock. So to solve this, the X-Men went to Japan to have an audience with a man named Lord Norrin, someone who Kwannon claimed to be Psylocke's mentor. Spoiler alert, Norrin didn't know anything about what was happening with the body switch ladies, so at the time, Kwannon decided to just join the X-Men and took on the codename Revanche. Of course, this caused friction within the team, since Psylocke was also part of it. That aside, this proved to be another pivotal moment in Psylocke's life. That's because Kwannon eventually came down with a deadly disease from the legacy virus, so she decided to take things into her own hands before she succumbed to it. That is to say, Kwannon orchestrated her own demise. Now remember, Betsy Braddock's mind was transferred to Kwannon's body and vice versa. That meant that Betsy's original body disappeared after Kwannon was gone. Kwannon also got psychically linked to Betsy when they body switched, which granted her telepathic abilities as well. So when Kwannon died, all of her memories were transferred to Betsy. This, in turn, gave Betsy an identity crisis. Her old friend and teammate Warren Worthington III, who has since become the superhero Archangel, would help her through this, and they'd even go on another mission spying on the Hellfire Club. Afterwards, Psylocke and Archangel grew closer and started a romantic relationship with each other. Sometime later, Psylocke would find herself at death's door when Sabretooth attacked her inside the X-Mansion. To save her life, Archangel and her teammates gave her a magical elixir called the Crimson Dawn. It initially proved to be effective, as not only did it heal Betsy, but it also augmented her telepathic abilities. However, she and the X-Men would eventually find out that the Crimson Dawn allowed an interdimensional tyrant named Kuragi to sink his hooks on her. Kuragi's plans of turning Psylocke into his bride were foiled when she and Warren beat him. From there, Betsy and Warren decided to hang up the capes and tights to live life as private citizens. Little did they know that this was going to be one short-lived retirement. That's because Psylocke was forced to enter the fray once again when the supervillain Shadow King manipulated her into shutting down all forms of mutant telepathy in the world. Psylocke would end up defeating the Shadow King by the end of this adventure, but at great cost. In order to take out the villain, Psylocke had to absorb and imprison him inside her mind. As a result, Betsy lost her telepathic abilities. Psylocke didn't stay depowered for too long though. Shortly after losing her ability, she and Jean Grey did a whole power exchange with each other that allowed Betsy to gain Jean's telekinetic abilities and vice versa. More developments to her status quo emerged too. For one, she and Warren ended their relationship, and Betsy eventually started dating another X-Men named Thunderbird. For another, she moved from the X-Men's blue team to an entirely different X-Squad led by Storm. But more strikingly though, Psylocke would eventually meet her end at the hands of the villain Vargas. You see, Vargas tried to assassinate her teammate Rogue because of some prophecy, but Betsy jumped in and she instead got taken out. After some time though, Psylocke mysteriously re-emerged on the same spot where she met her demise. The X-Men were weary when they found out about this, but ultimately confirmed that yes, this was no imposter, this was Betsy Braddock for real. So Betsy eventually rejoined Storm's X-Team. We then find out the reason for Psylocke's resurrection. It turns out that the person responsible for this was none other than her older brother Jamie, who had since recovered from his coma. He proceeded to manipulate events that would allow Betsy to come back to life and become immune to any form of reality manipulation. You see, Jamie had a vision that powerful evil entities called the Forsaken and the First Fallen would attack all of reality, so so he pretty much decided to turn his sister into a weapon against them. And it worked too. Psylocke ended up defeating them, and Jamie was even able to send her back to her mutant teammates after this adventure. Psylocke saves the multiverse. Psylocke would then go on to face off against an evil version of Professor X and the X-Men who came from an alternate reality. She'd team up with Excalibur to stop these interdimensional evildoers who would eventually find out that this villainous version of Charles Xavier was none other than the Shadow King. It was revealed that the Shadow King escaped the psychic prison that Betsy trapped him in when she initially died. During their battle, Psylocke was suddenly transported to the time stream and eventually found herself at the Crystal Palace. Now, the Crystal Palace also serves as a base of operations for the Exiles, a superhero group from the Marvel Universe who vowed to protect it. Psylocke would join the Exiles and even form a romantic relationship with an alternate good guy version of Sabretooth. She and the Exiles then went on numerous multiverse hopping adventures. In perhaps her most notable adventure during this period, Psylocke had to contend with her old foe Slaymaster, who went hellbent on assassinating any and all Betsy Braddocks he could find in the Marvel multiverse. Psylocke came out on top, and just to make sure Slaymaster stayed down, she tracked the villain to her home reality, Earth 616, and took him out. Betsy gets her body back. Psylocke eventually left the Exiles. Soon after that, Madeline Pryor, aka the Goblin Queen, discovered Betsy floating around dimensions, so she and her shady organization called the Sisterhood decided to take Betsy in. But Madeline had ulterior motives. First, she and the Sisterhood dug up Kwannon's grave to retrieve Betsy's original body. Then, they transferred Betsy's mind to her original body and mind controlled her into becoming Madeline's lackey. Another Freaky Friday scenario ensued when the mutant pop star superhero Dazzler fought the brainwashed Betsy and managed to nearly destroy her original body. As a result, Betsy freed herself from Madeline's mind control, and since her original form was damaged beyond repair, she transferred her consciousness to Kwannon's body again. Even better, Psylocke regained her original mutant telepathic abilities because of these events. Soon after that, Psylocke would help the rest of mutantdom to settle in their newfound independent island nation of Utopia. After that, Psylocke flew all the way to Japan to return her Japanese body to its resting place. There, she was attacked by Matsuo Soriyama and his hand ninjas again. This encounter solidified Betsy's resolve to put a permanent end to this guy, which she ultimately did with a well-placed psychic knife. Betsy then went back to Utopia and served as one of its many protectors. Psylocke, secret assassin. There came a time when Cyclops, who had since assumed leadership of all mutant kind, decided to dissolve X-Force, the X-Men's very own Black Ops team. He ordered Wolverine to do this, but the Claude Canuck had other ideas. Instead of disbanding the mutant hit squad, Wolfie decided to keep it going in secret and only allow his most trusted friends to be part of it. This revamped X-Force team included Psylocke, Archangel, Phantom X, Deadpool, and Wolverine. As part of X-Force, one of their early missions came in the form of stopping the return of the ancient mutant supervillain Apocalypse. Psylocke eventually located Apocalypse, but decided against assassinating him when she found out that he had been resurrected as a young boy. So Psylocke decided to put this new, non-villainous version of Apocalypse under her protection. It didn't go so well because Phantom X ended up taking out the boy. Still, Betsy continued to act as a member of X-Force after all of this. Now, don't think for a second that Psylocke had gone soft because she just wanted to protect a kid, because next time that we see her, Betsy went on a bloody tear through Utopia when she discovered that the villainous Reavers had snuck into the mutant island nation, only leaving the infiltrators' lifeless bodies in their wake. Internal strife plagued Psylocke and her X-Force crew when the Shadow King returned for another fight. The villain managed to unleash Archangel's dark persona when he discovered what X-Force did to the young Apocalypse and triggered what's called an Ascension Protocol inside Warren's psyche. Now, the Ascension Protocol is basically this failsafe that allows Archangel to take Apocalypse's place. The long and short of it is that if Warren got overtaken by his evil persona and became a supervillain, that Betsy and the X-Force had to deal with. What's worse is that the evil ascended from the Archangel contained a death seed, which pretty much turned Warren into the personification of death. To help Archangel return to his usual superheroic self, Psylocke and her team traveled to an alternate dimension to locate a life seed that would null Archangel's death seed. They managed to do this, but fell short of using it on Warren when they returned to their original reality. This is because when they got back to Earth 616, Archangel ambushed them and nearly took all of X-Force out. In a last-ditch effort, Psylocke tried to give Archangel some good old talk therapy and try to reach into his consciousness. It didn't go so well, and instead of bringing back the friend and ally they once known and loved, Archangel instead ended up turning Psylocke into the newest iteration of Death, its most powerful powerful minion. However, one of the active X-Force member, Phantom X, managed to get help from alternate versions of the X-Men to stop Archangel. One of its members, a Jean Grey from another reality, successfully restored Psylocke's mind and freed her from Archangel's control. Psylocke and Phantom X then fought Archangel in a climactic battle that saw her taking out Warren for good. Somewhere along the way though, Warren got resurrected, only for Psylocke to discover that this wasn't the man that she once loved. Simply put, Marvel brought Warren back to life without his memory. Eventually, Wolverine and Cyclops had a falling out of all mutantdom, was split into two camps. Not for Psylocke though, as she managed to play on both sides of the rift. One hand, she continued to operate as a Wetworks agent for the Wolverine-led X-Force, while on the other hand, Psylocke was rolling with Cyclops and his newly formed Extinction Team. Betsy's next adventure came when her brothers Jamie and Brian kidnapped her and Phantom X. They then sentenced Phantom X to pay for his crimes, namely assassinating the young Apocalypse, while the two Braddock men chastised their sister for becoming an assassin. Nothing much came of this stern talking to though, because Betsy ended up taking on the Lady Britain identity and saved Phantom X from being executed. However, she was just a bit too late, as Phantom X had already been injected with a lethal dose of anti-reality serum before she could swoop in to save him. To help her friend, Betsy and Phantom X headed for the magical Forest of Sorrows, where she made an agreement with Crockwell, its presiding guardian and ruler, to help Phantom X survive in exchange for her ability to feel sorrow. In the end, Phantom X was saved from being erased from reality, but Psylocke was now unable to feel sorrow no matter what. This effectively changed Betsy's personality and turned her into a cold, almost machine-like person who was unable to feel any natural human emotion at all. She and Phantom X would then go back to Jamie and Brian, where they would assist their Captain Britain Corps in defeating and invading Goat Demon. Betsy would eventually find out that the Goat Demon was her brother Jamie from the future. To stop the dastardly villain, Psylocke decided to nip it right at the source. That is to say, she aimed to terminate Jamie from the present to prevent him from inevitably becoming the Goat Demon in the future. To do this, she asked her twin brother Brian to take out Jamie. Brian was having none of it, so she went ahead and used her telepathy to control Brian's mind and body to manipulate him into getting their older brother's life and prevent him from ever becoming the Goat Demon. This ultimately caused Psylocke and Brian's relationship to fracture, and in the aftermath, she got together with Phantom X as a nice way to force herself into feeling natural human emotions again. Not long after, the Shadow King would emerge again to make Betsy's life a living hell. He'd team up with the other villains that she and the X-Force had defeated in the past and kidnap Psylocke. They also nabbed Evan, a clone of the young Apocalypse that Phantom X created, to use the boy and turn him into a new version of the OG Apocalypse. Phantom X would then rescue Psylocke at the cost of her own life. Afterwards, she'd find herself transported to the future where Evan had already become the new Apocalypse. In this version of the future, Betsy had turned into a brutal figure known as the Magistrate Braddock, who's in charge of terminating any and all threats before they even happened. As a result, this world became a totalitarian hellscape. Betsy initially thought of taking out her future self in order to fix things, but then she realized that doing so would mean that she'd inevitably turn into this Magistrate Braddock when she got back to the present. So to make sure that this possible future didn't happen, Psylocke decided to take herself out and use her katana on herself. However, she failed to fully realize this plan when the X-Force from the future eventually prevented her from dying. In the end, she had a stern discussion with her future self before going back to her original timeline. Once in the present, Psylocke and X-Force went ahead and rescued Evan from the clutches of the Shadow King and his evil brotherhood. She was ultimately able to trap the Shadow King in a vegetative state. For a moment, she thought of taking his life, but ultimately decided against it. Having become wary from her time as an assassin, Psylocke threw away her trademark katana and made a promise to herself that she'd never take a life again. She'd then go on and reconcile her relationship with Brian. In one last adventure with X-Force, she discovered that Phantom X was still alive, thanks to his cloning technology. Betsy and Phantom X would then promptly leave X-Force and attempt to start a new life together. Betsy becomes Britain's best hero. Eventually, the X-Men and the Avengers went to war with each other when the Phoenix Force threatened to return to Earth and possess the young mutant Hope Summers. In the ensuing debacle, Psylocke initially allied herself with her fellow mutants against Earth's mightiest heroes. Along the way, the X-Men's most prominent figures like Cyclops, Emma Frost, Namor, Magik, and Colossus fused with the Phoenix Force to form a cosmically powered team called the Phoenix Force 5. Eventually, the Phoenix Force started to corrupt these heroes, which prompted Psylocke to take her talents to the Avengers side and stop a Phoenix Force tainted Cyclops from wrecking everything. Afterwards, Betsy and Phantom X would continue going on their own legally questionable exploits in Paris, but they'd end their relationship on bad terms after she cheated on him with another one of his clones. She then packed up her stuff and returned to the US to live at the Wolverine-helmed Jean Grey School for Higher Learning. There, she took on a short stint as one of the school's teachers. However, Wolverine gave her the boot when he found out that she had anger management issues. That's a little rich coming from Wolverine, don't you think? So instead of being an educator, Betsy decided to resume her life as a superhero. She teamed up with Puck and Storm, after which they proceeded to face the villain Spiral. Now, Spiral is someone who you might consider as Psylocke's arch nemesis, given that she used to roll with Mojo in Mojo World. So when they met this time, Psylocke was totally ready to put a permanent end to this six-armed warrior. As this adventure went on though, Spiral would end up rescuing Psylocke when they had to fight the demon bear, who in turn possessed Bishop's body. And in the end, Betsy let bygones be bygones, opting to forgive Spiral for her past transgressions against her instead of, assassinating her. Plus, Psylocke had already vowed to never take another life. Well, that's more of a guideline instead of a rule. That's because Psylocke and Spiral eventually discovered that the true villain behind everything that happened up until this point was Cassandra Nova. Psylocke and a few other mutant superheroes then decided to confront Cassandra, but Betsy ended up getting kidnapped again by this powered telepathic villainess. Cassandra even offered to become allies in exchange for Betsy getting her original British body back via a clone, but she refused. Instead, Psylocke forced Cassandra's mind to enter Betsy's cloned body, and remember her vow to never take a life again? Yeah, that all went out the window when Psylocke took out Cassandra while she was inside Betsy's cloned body. Psylocke was immediately able to put her life back on track after all of this. She started working as a guardian and a part-time combat instructor at the Jean Grey School, in between going on more superheroic adventures. Unknown to her, during this period of relative peace, it would soon come to an end. As the old saying goes, Betsy didn't choose the assassin life, the assassin life chose her. She'd eventually rejoin a new version of X-Force, this time led by Cable. To make matters worse, she got back into the habit of brutally taking out their targets during this stint with the new X-Force. On a bright side though, Betsy would eventually renew her no-killing vow when she faced off against a deranged Phantom X. They got into a fight and Psylocke ultimately came out on top, but instead of taking Phantom X's life, she instead used her ability Blade to stab Phantom X's mind and pretty much stop him from being insane. Sometime later, Marvel's mutants would find themselves at odds with the Inhumans. This sprung from the fact that the Inhumans' trademark, Terrigen Mist, were found to be harmful to mutants. To further complicate things, mutants were facing a two-pronged war. Aside from beefing with the Inhumans, they also had to deal with the anti-mutant factions around the world who had started to use the Mist as a form of a biological weapon against the children of Adam. During this period, Magneto took it upon himself to rebuild a new X-Men team to protect their kind. In light of this, the Master of Magnetism recruited Psylocke to be part of his new crew he's building. Suffice it to say that this working relationship did not work out swimmingly. The long and short of it is that Magneto made super shady moves that quickly made this partnership with Psylocke deteriorate. These include hiring Phantom X as a secret X-Men, knowing full well that he and Betsy had issues with each other. On top of that, Psylocke and Magneto's relationship further strained when she disagreed with him in assassinating the Inhuman boy named Ulysses. At this point, Betsy realized that Magneto was pulling her strings instead of treating her as a legit partner in protecting mutantdom from external threats. It all came to a head when Psylocke ultimately found out that Magneto is in league with the Hellfire Club. He tried to entice her into joining the secret society as its new Black Queen, but Psylocke refused. Instead, she resigned her position from Magneto's X-Men and struck out on her own as a solo superhero. But that's not where her beef with Magneto ends. Psylocke would eventually discover that Magneto pretty much pulled the strings that ignited the war between mutants and Inhumans. At this point, we don't blame Betsy for having it up to here with Magneto and his schemes, so she confronted him and they started to fight. In fact, Psylocke deemed Magneto to be too much of a threat to mutant kind at this time, so she broke her no-kill policy a second time. That's right, Psylocke assassinated Magneto with one of her psychic blades. By this time, the confrontation was over. Betsy had concluded that the entire world would be better off without someone like Magneto. On the other hand, she was in a bad spot as well, since she also realized that it would serve the X-Men well if she wasn't part of it anymore. After some time, the Shadow King would pester Psylocke yet again when he re-emerged to take out any psychic he could find on Earth. In response, Betsy and the X-Men confronted the Shadow King and ultimately discovered that he was holding Professor X's consciousness hostage. Now you should know that Professor X had been confirmed dead since Cyclops went insane during the X-Men in war with the Avengers. But as mainstream superhero comics go, this was retconned when it was revealed that he was still alive inside of Shadow King. In any case, Psylocke and the X-Men proceeded to thwart the Shadow King yet again, and even bring Professor X back to life by infusing his consciousness with Phantom X's body. Some time would pass, and Betsy would find herself on an adventure where she came to face with Sapphire's sticks. Sapphire is what you call a psychic vampire, so she used her powers to absorb Betsy's soul and trap her inside of Sapphire's psyche. All the while, Psylocke's body was left for dead. However, Betsy was able to eventually free herself by vanquishing Sapphire from within her mind. Not only that, but she was able to use this as an opportunity to recreate her original form, the British one, and resurrect herself in this body. As a result, Betsy and Kwannon's ties were severed, and Psylocke resumed her position as an X-Men. Betsy comes into her own. Now in her original body yet again, Betsy eventually found out that Kwannon had also returned to her original form. This prompted Betsy to drop the Psylocke codename so she could forge her own destiny. Things were popping in the best way for all of mutant kind during this era too, as they managed to re-establish an all-new sovereign island nation on the sentient island Krakoa. In addition to that, her older brother Jamie also came back to life in wake of all of this. Betsy would opt to live on Krakoa along with her other mutants. Not long after that, she would reunite with her twin brother Brian to go on adventures in Otherworld. Once there, she and Brian confronted the evil sorceress Morgan Le Fay, which ended with Brian falling under her control. This prompted Betsy to assume the Captain Britain mantle again. In fact, Betsy would be officially recognized as the new Captain Britain of the Marvel Universe at this point, as she reformed the superhero team Excalibur, and they pretty much became the liaison between Krakoa, Otherworld, and her homeland, the United Kingdom. Things came to a head when Betsy had to fight the mind-controlled Brian, a confrontation that ended with Betsy taking out her twin brother. But it's okay, because Brian would soon be resurrected by Jamie. Betsy thought that Brian would retake his position as Captain Britain upon his return, but he ultimately turned it down, allowing Betsy to operate as the rightful heir to the mantle. As Captain Britain, Betsy would go on to participate in a magical tournament that would determine the fate of the Captain Britain Corps. This was an event hosted by the insidious Saturn, where Betsy ultimately found her soul shattered to pieces. In the end, it took help from Kwannon, who was, for all intents and purposes, the new Psylocke of the Marvel Universe at this point, to bring Betsy back to life. Betsy would then resume her role as Captain Britain, and not long after, she and Saturn would form a shaky alliance with each other, with Betsy serving as a diplomat for Otherworld. She'd also find herself teaming up with Dr. Doom at one point, where she'd uncover a conspiracy in Otherworld. You see, mutants have started relocating to Otherworld as well, since it and Krakoa had formed a sort of diplomatic alliance with each other. On that note, the conspiracy Betsy uncovered involved Merlin, the disposed ruler of Starlight Citadel, who had an axe to grind with Saturn, basically going on a smear campaign against mutants in Otherworld. This in turn caused upheaval in Saturn's court, which Merlin sought to take advantage of. The whole episode climaxed when Merlin allied himself with King Arthur and attempted to mount a coup against Saturn, a bitter and dimension-spanning war that ensued between Merlin's forces and the combined might of Krakoa, Otherworld's Starlight Citadel, and the realm of Avalon. In the end, Betsy and her forces were able to thwart Merlin's army and capture him. In her duties as Captain Britain, she proceeded to execute the sorcerer. On a brighter note, this whole adventure saw a new love interest for Betsy, her old friend and fellow mutant, Rachel Summers. By the end of the war, Betsy declared that she would cut her ties with Saturn's Starlight Citadel and instead brand herself as a protector of the entire Marvel multiverse. Shortly after, she would reconnect and re-establish the Captain Britain Corps. Betsy would then return to Earth 616, only to discover that some humans were being horrible to mutantdom again, specifically an evil organization named Orchis that went on a killing spree, taking out mutants left and right. As Captain Britain, she'd declare her support for mutants all over the world and focus her efforts on helping British Homo Superior. In addition to that, Betsy also secretly teamed up with a group called X-Corps, which was an underground cell of mutant freedom fighters dedicated to rescuing their fellow mutants from Orchis. She'd eventually discovered that the demon Selene was pulling the strings all along, using Orchis as a way to gather mutants so that she could use their souls for a mystical ritual called the Ascension. The Ascension would basically turn Selene into a god, and Captain Britain was having none of that. Along the way, she'd confront the British government for their inactivity in the looming crisis happening to mutant kind. This all culminated with Betsy and her crew getting into it with a bunch of ignorant British cops who attacked them during one of their missions. After that mess, Betsy declared that she would renounce any and all ties she had with the UK. Betsy and her team ultimately defeated Selene before she could fully realize her plans of becoming a legitimate god. Afterwards, she resigned from the X-Corps and went back to her new lover, Rachel Summers. Sometime time would pass and the Krakoan nation would eventually meet its end. Betsy and Rachel would then opt to live lives on Braddock Manor, and after that, their whole war against Orcus and Selene, suffice it to say that Betsy was clamoring for some time off. But adventure soon showed up at their front doorstep when the X-Men Forge approached Betsy and Rachel with a proposition for the two heroes to join a new initiative he's cooking. This team would basically be dedicated to stopping evil before it happened with the help of an invention that Forge created called the analog. Betsy had her issues from this from the start, since they basically were branding people guilty before they could even commit crime. However, Rachel convinced her to be part of the Forge's new team and even dubbed it as the new X-Force.